In this passage, Mark recorded the challenge that was given to Jesus' authority by the chief priests and scribes and elders, and how Jesus responded to this challenge by asking them a question about John the Baptist's ministry, which exposed their insincere motives and the fear that they had of the people. And Jesus also responded to them by telling them a parable of the vineyard owner, in which the faithless servant farmers, which represented the Jewish leaders, consistently rejected all the representatives of the vineyard owner, which represents God. And even when the owner's son was sent, which of course represents Jesus, and thereby they brought judgment upon themselves, forfeiting their rights to the vineyard, which is the Jewish leaders' rights to be the leaders of God's people. And so Mark records these episodes, I think, so that his readers would understand that Jesus' rejection by the Jewish leaders was really a fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies about him, and that as God's Son, Jesus' authority came directly from God. So I think there's at least one principle that we could draw out of this passage, and that's because Jesus holds all authority, our lives need to be centered on him. So any attempt to build our lives on something other than him is ultimately fruitless and eventually leads us to destruction. So there's several discussion questions that I think might be helpful for your groups. The first one is this: why do you think that Jesus refuses to answer the Jewish leaders' question directly? Why did Jesus respond with a question? And really, this is the first in a series of challenges or questions that the Jewish leaders confronted Jesus with. You'll see this also in verses 14 through 15 of chapter 12, verses 19 through 23, and also in verses 28 of chapter 12. So notice how in several instances Jesus responds to this challenge, not by answering the question directly, but by asking them a question of his own. But it's important to note that Jesus really isn't just dodging the question here. In fact, in this passage, his question about John's ministry is basically to make the point that if John's ministry was from God, then obviously Jesus' ministry was from God, and also his authority comes from God as a result. So this was obviously demonstrated when Jesus was baptized by John, and the voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my son, listen to him." And I think another reason might be that Jesus, he was able to sense the insincerity of the Jewish leaders' question. And so he asks his own question to kind of expose their false motives and their agenda of his questioners. And notice how that twice in this passage, Mark points out that the Jewish leaders were afraid of the crowds. We see this both in 11:32 and 12:12. Then, after asking his own question, Jesus follows up by telling the Jewish leaders a parable, which I think is also designed to answer the question that they were raising, which was, what is his authority? By whose authority is he doing these things? But unlike other occasions, the Jewish leaders this time, they understood perfectly well what Jesus was saying. So the problem was not that they was not understanding. The problem was that they simply wouldn't accept it. And so in this message, Cody, in his message this weekend, Cody's going to be referencing Romans 1, verses 18 through 25, which gets at this issue of the heart. For most people, the issue is not one of being able to intellectually accept the truths about Jesus, but it's really an issue of the heart. And we see that clearly in the Romans Passion passage that talks about the stubborn rebelliousness of the human heart. So you may want to review that passage as well, because Cody's going to touch on that in his message. So the point of this discussion question is really to get people thinking about how Jesus dealt with people who were in opposition to him. And notice, I think one of the main things that we should draw from this is how Jesus always gets right to the heart of the issue. He always is able to see through the external things and get right to the heart issue that's really behind a person's question or behind their opposition. So there might be instances when we can use a similar technique, but Of course, we need to make sure that our goal in doing that is not just to be a smarty pants, but we're really trying to help get to what's the real heart issue for somebody. And of course, by the way, this might not be a good line of questioning to respond to a police officer when he asks you how fast you were going. So in this passage, or the second question that we have for discussion is this. In this passage, the Jewish leaders challenge Jesus' authority. So if our lives are not fully submitted to him, does this mean that we are challenging Jesus' authority too? Why or why not? So the point of this question is to get people thinking about their obedience or lack thereof, and how that's a reflection of how they really view Jesus' authority. Of course, most people will readily acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God, and so he actually does have all authority. And as a result, people might hesitate to think of themselves as really challenging Jesus' authority. But I think the real question is, do we really live as though we're surrendered to Jesus' authority? And so if not, what is it that keeps us from fully obeying him? The last question that I have is kind of builds on the second one. Are there areas in your life that are not fully submitted to Jesus' authority? Is there something else that effectively is serving as the, quote, cornerstone of your life? We see this in this passage, the reference to Jesus being the cornerstone. So if that's the case, what is one specific thing you can do to begin changing that? And how can your group help you with that? So if your folks in your group seem to be okay with their level of obedience, I would encourage you to challenge them by bringing them back to some of the words of Jesus in the preceding chapters. Things like take up your cross in chapter 8. If anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all in chapter 9. How hard it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. We see that in chapter 10. And similarly, whoever wants to be first among you must be slave to all. We see that in chapter 10 as well. So here's where your folks need to get honest and open about where they're really at. And this is where you as the leader need to lead out in that, and to be the first one to talk about areas, frankly, where you have a struggle in obeying Jesus. So challenge each other to take some simple steps of obedience that will begin to put you, or to move you a little bit further down the path of being more fully surrendered to Jesus. So even very small steps, if you take them consistently over a period of time, can yield some very significant results over time. So I really want to encourage you guys to think carefully about this issue of authority. That seems to be the central issue in this passage, and whether our lives really reflect that reality, that they're surrendered to the authority of Jesus.